good thing. Now, don't confuse constraints with rotation limits. For example, a limit would be where one joint can't move further than a certain rotation. Like my elbow cannot bend further than this. That's a limit. A constraint is a way to force one object to do what you want it to do at all times, no matter what. Some of the important constraints are things like the translation constraint or point constraint. Now, this constraint forces one object to be translated to the position of another object. For example, if I translate this blue ball to the green ball, wherever I move this green ball, this blue ball has to go. Now, this doesn't mean however I rotate this green ball, this blue ball will rotate. That's not the case. This is only translation. So if I rotate this green ball, nothing happens to this blue ball. Now, where would you use this translation constraint? Say you have a character who needs to jump in a car and drive around and then jump out of a car. Well, in the old days, before constraints, we would have 3 different models for this. We would have the character, the car, and a model of the character in the car. So you would do this by animating the character to hop in the car, then turn off the character and turn off the car, and then turn on the model of the character already in the car. And when you move them around, it's just one model, so of course it looks like the character's in the car. Now, there's nothing really wrong with this, but it's an old way of doing things, and especially nowadays, it's going to affect things like special effects that you add to your character or motion blur for that scene, because on that instant, there's not going to be any motion blur. It also makes your scene bigger, and it's harder to organize that way. So with the translation constraint, you can constrain your character to the car and then just move the car around, and the character will move with the car. When you want the character to get out of the car, just lower the enforcement of the translation constraint down to 0. And now your character and car can move freely by themselves. Pretty much in conjunction with the translation constraint, there is an orientation constraint or a rotation constraint. Now, what that does is, say I have a blue cone and a green cone. If I orient constraint this blue cone to this green cone, it doesn't move anywhere. It doesn't translate anywhere. But if I rotate this green cone, this blue cone will rotate just like it. Now, where would you use this? Well, for characters, most of them have 2 eyeballs. And in the theme of keeping things simple, say you just want to animate 1 eyeball. So you can orient constraint the other eyeball to this 1 eyeball that you're rotating, and that's one thing to animate now, just that 1 eyeball. You don't have to animate 2 eyeballs anymore. And you can be sure that wherever this eyeball is looking, the other one's going to be rotating just like it. You can also use these 2 constraints when picking up objects. Say you have a character such as a bean who's going to pick up a gun. Now, you would need to use 2 constraints. You would need to use a translation constraint to translate this gun to that bean's hand. And then you would need to orient constraint to orient that gun to follow the rotation of the hand. So the gun looks totally like it's in this bean's hand. The third important constraint is the aim constraint, and it pretty much does what it says. It forces one object to aim at something else at all times. So say I have a blue cone that's aim constraint to a green cone. Now you're going to see that this blue cone is going to point to this green cone no matter where I move this green cone. Now, where would you use this aim constraint? Well, in character animation, let's go back to the eyeball animation we were doing, where the right eye was orient constraint to the left eye. Now, say we had a scene where a character needed to look at certain objects on a table, and we wanted to make sure that he was really looking at these objects. Well, instead of guessing where these eyes are going to be looking by just rotating and estimating, we can tell it exactly where it should look by aim constraining the eye to a certain null or locator. So wherever we translate this locator, the eyes are looking exactly at that spot. Now, there's other constraints like scale constraints or surface constraints or tangent constraints, things like that. They're not very widely used. Well, for example, surface constraints might be used for keeping objects on the surface of a model, maybe a teardrop or a sweat rolling down someone's cheek. Now, the constraints I talked about earlier are very important in character setup because they